Hey Liz,
Good morning. Good afternoon.
good day.
Yeah.
So, Paul, how is my audio now? I switched.
Yeah, it's better.
This is better, really.
Yes.
Okay, fair enough. Then go with the iPad speakers then.
Yeah, go with the iPad. As long as there's no some sort of Bluetooth that will suddenly die halfway through, then we're good, right? We don't edit, so we like the human element of this. We've had some episodes with some fantastic bloopers that we keep in, like my
Okay.
daughter phoning us in the middle and everything else.
Oh, actually, that's a really good point. I don't even know where my phone is, so I think we're okay.
Okay, fine.
Any questions before we start?
No, all good.
All right, excellent. Good. So here we go.
Welcome to Fintech Daydreaming, the podcast that dives into the world of banking technologies and the ever-changing landscape of fintech companies. We bring you real-life examples from global and local thought leaders, as well as experts working within the financial industry, and seek out the best stories from the front lines of financial services innovation, where dreams of industry pioneers meet reality. Hosted by Paul Krogdahl and Ville Sointu. This is Fintech Daydreaming.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of Fintech Daydreaming. My name is Ville Sointu, and I will be your host for today's episode. But as always, I'm of course not alone. I'm joined by my good friend and co-host, Paul Krogdahl. Paul, how are things with you today?
I'm still here in Espoo. Where on earth are you? I mean, Every single episode, you have to connect from somewhere in the world. It is impossible for us to have good quality sound and everything else because you keep traveling.
That's true. That's true. And my better microphone is so huge, it's difficult to carry it around with me. So that actually does create a bit of a problem. So we're again apologizing for any possible audio quality issues that we have today on my side. But I think we will manage anyway. I am actually in London today, so I'm attending. I'm speaking at the Mobi Forum conference, which is being held here at the HSBC headquarters in Canary Wharf. And the facilities are great. Conference was a lot of fun. We got to do a debate on the merits of financial services in the metaverse. And the debate was a lot of fun to basically find all sorts of flaws in that.
Boring. Ville, boring. I've only got two important questions to you. One, did you go and say hello to my family?
No, not yet.
Okay, disowning you for that. Two, have you already had fish and chips?
No, I haven't done that either because I actually landed I landed yesterday straight from Amsterdam, London City Airport, straight to the stage, on the stage yesterday. So again, I haven't had a chance to do much here. But again, I will put that on the list for tomorrow. Hopefully I will have some time even outside the conference.
2 minus points to you, I'm afraid. You're down in the ranks of Fintech Daydreaming ranking system. Go and have some fish and chips.
Absolutely, I will. Good, but hey, that's enough chit chat for us today. Even though it's always fun to guess where I am in the world this time around, but I think we need to get to the actual content as we always prefer to do here on the podcast. And today, as always, we have a fantastic guest who's joining us to talk about, for example, the book that she has written, and then we will go into all sorts of interesting topics related to bank branding. So Liz, welcome. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you. So I'm quite jealous though that you're in my home city and my favorite city in the world. So small amount of envy today.
Yeah, I love London as well. It's a little bit of a weird feeling here due to what's happened with the royal family now. But it's all part of the full English experience, I guess. So it's really interesting times to be here in London, and of course the business and the discussions about all good things fintech are interesting as well. But hey, Liz, please tell us a little bit about yourself. Who are you? Why are you here today? And what are we going to be talking about?
Yeah, so I'm Liz High. Although I, am originally from the UK and I live in Seattle. So if you see me doing quick kind of swigs of coffee through the conversation, it's because it's 6 in the morning here. So just be gentle with me. So I have a long career working in insight marketing, brand strategy. I owned my own insight agency out of London for probably about 12 years. And I worked at this really interesting intersection of traditional research and insight and technology. So again, I'm kind of aging myself, but I worked very much at the beginnings of social media and really thinking about what that looked like as a data set, and how you could get all this insight from these millions of conversations that were happening out in the world. So I actually sold my traditional research, ethnographic, and innovation agency to a software company. And that was really the beginning of my love of the intersection between humans and technology. So I've really spent probably the last 10 years really focusing on how to use that in financial services and fintech.
All right.
So how do you get really close to customers? How do you build brands that connect with customers? My last role, I worked with Nimbus, a platform business that's about bringing really meaningful digital banking to niche groups of customers. So it's been a long journey, but the core things are brands, data, and a love for the human condition.
Great. And later on in the conversation, remind me to ask you how on earth did you land in financial services of all things? But again, that's the reason we have you here on our little fintech podcast here, of course. So we are happy for that decision, of course. But before we get to all the kind of good content bits of our conversation, we do have to honor the tradition that we have on our podcast, which is that we ask our guests to tell a fintech or banking related joke. Now, again, usually my co-host Paul does this in the end of the show. I do it in the beginning. So we're kind of having a bit of a competition here as well. But Liz, as I understood, you actually might have a joke for us.
I do. I have 2 jokes for you,
okay.
And there's good reason for that. I have a co-author of my book who's Allison Netzer, and she's the CMO of Nimbus. And much like you, she has a travel schedule that is impenetrable. So unfortunately, she can't join us this morning. So joke number 1 goes out to Allison, and just to set the context for her 2 young boys who are kind of 8 and 6. So that's just setting the bar. So number 1 is, what's a shark's favorite investment category?
Don't know. Tell me.
Fintech.
Oh, that was so obvious. I should have known that.
Okay, and the second one, maybe slightly higher bar, but not much, more for the kind of adult audience. So did you hear about the VC who got out of fintech and decided to go into horse breeding?
No.
They wanted more stable returns.
It almost seems like you have been listening to our episodes, because that is exactly the type of jokes that our guests have been telling, and our listeners enjoy. By the way, it's one of the most common feedbacks we get is that please keep on with the jokes. That's a really refreshing part. So we will definitely continue, and thank you for honoring this tradition that we have in the podcast. Again, good stuff, and thank you to Allison as well. Unfortunately, who couldn't join us today, but we will get to connect later, of course. But hey, let's get started with the discussion. Again, you already mentioned that you have written together with Allison, you've written a book. The book is called Think Like a Brand, Not a Bank. And I guess we should start by talking a little bit about what was the thought process behind writing this book. So what did you want to achieve, and what types of questions you might wanted to answer when writing this book?
Yeah. So I think one of the things that struck both Allison and I is that there's so much passion in the banking and the fintech industry for trying to do the right thing for customers. And, I've been working as a consultant in kind of banking for, probably pretty consistently for the last 10 years. And I found myself having the same conversations with each institution. I found the same barriers being put up. Oh, we can't do this because of technology. We can't do this because our board will never agree. We can't do this because we all work in silos. And, if I had $1 for, every single time I'd heard those things, I probably wouldn't be having to write the book, Yeah. I'd be on a beach now.
Yeah.
But the goal of the book was to take everything that Allison and I have learned kind of over the past 10 years dealing with many, many institutions and say, look, let's demystify the fact that innovation and customer engagement has to be like a $1 million McKinsey, engagement, that it has to involve a complete, re-platform. It can start with mindset. Because as a consultant, you go in and your job is to take your mindset and help the bank to understand how to think differently about things and get all those barriers out. So it really was us, it was really fun writing it because we were just talking about all the stuff we were passionate about and kind of getting it down on paper.
I'm wondering, to a certain degree, banks have in the past had a monopoly, right? We all as adults needed in one form or another banking. There's always been that argument, we need banking, we don't need banks. But banks having a monopoly is part of the problem, maybe historically being that banks have felt that they don't need to worry about their brand because the customers will come anyway.
100%. And, traditionally, and, I just upfront, I love banking. I love banks. I love what they do for the communities. I particularly love kind of the community banking, scenario that's very strong in the US. And banks have always been about geography. So your bank is where you are, whether it's part of a big international chain, it's an HSBC, your bank is in your community. But the whole concept of what a community is totally changing. And that's digital is driving that. And banks have never had to think very much beyond what do I need to do for the people I know really well that live within this kind of, space around me. And when your brand is really being there, you don't have to think about the rest of it. But where your brand now has to be about being relevant in the context of your customers, brand is critical. So it's like a complete turnaround in what banking has to be.
Now, this actually brings a topic to my mind, which is actually something we were going to talk a little bit later, but let's bring it up right now, which is the local physical element of banks tradition. So you're part of the society, like you mentioned, you're part of the community around where you live, and that's how you build trust ultimately. And I think there's an interesting dynamic at play. As you said, as we move to digital and the communities become online and global, real-time, always on type of places rather than any physical place, I personally still think that there is an element that is required to be local in order to build the trust, especially in financial services, because again, trust is built on a local level for many reasons, one of them being legal enforcement, and of course the fact that you have a place to go if things go wrong. So reaching a multi-country global conglomerate might not be as easy as just walking to a place that and especially when it's money, that's an important thing in my mind. But so is that the old way of thinking? I mean, is it going to completely change, or are we going to see something in the middle between this online versus offline trust building? And how do you see this? Is this old thinking versus new thinking, and where are we going?
Oh my goodness, I said be gentle with me. This is something I'm really passionate about, actually, is that the notion of space and banking having to take place in a defined space, I think, is changing. I think there are generations that are moving through, Allison's kids that, we did the joke for, thinking about my teenagers who are probably about to get up in a minute and be really noisy. I'm just warning you. The whole thing about going to a bank and talking about money in a safe place just isn't in their psyche.
Right.
But there is still the importance of being able to build a relationship when it comes to the big purchases in life, when it's things like, I want to think about a mortgage. I know I can go to Rocket Mortgage and I can get one like that. But there's a whole lot of things that have to happen before I'm ready to press that button. And traditionally, those would happen in a place that the bank defines as the place to go and have that conversation.
Yeah.
My kind of view is what will happen is that there will be community places, and the banks and the advisors will come to you. And maybe the people that are those advisors will change as well. So there's still that importance of the relationship in really big financial decisions, but I don't think it has to be tied to a bank location, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I'm now taking a tangent here in the conversation, but I have to bring this up because, as I mentioned, I'm right now in a conference where one of the biggest topics right now is here today is the metaverse. So again, the new dimension of perhaps providing banking services or financial services, and there's been a lot of back and forth about this even here during the conference, but. It's again, I'm coming back to the fact that maybe we're just getting old, and it's difficult for us to wrap our heads around the fact that people might actually prefer to work in this virtual environment. So, what is your take on the way the metaverse discussion is happening today? Do you think banks can actually and should go and build their brands in the metaverse? And if yes, how should they do it?
So I think that the worst thing that banks could do, and we talk about this in the book, that the initial part of the digital revolution was when digital kind of came out, and all anyone did was take all of their branch brochures and put them online. They took their product information and they put it online, and maybe they added a few kind of smiley, happy people to kind of make it feel a little bit more human. But that was trying to take one experience and put it into a different environment, which doesn't work, certainly from a brand perspective. Yeah. And I think if banks try to do the same thing, which is take a traditional bank and, move into the metaverse and have your digital teller, that's not what the potential of the metaverse is. Yeah. To me, the metaverse, don't put a branch, in the metaverse. Put education, build a community, facilitate those really difficult conversations. Yeah, I worked on a neobank recently, and their whole concept was around facilitating the difficult conversations between the generations. So, the big transfer of wealth that's going to happen between boomers, the poor Gen Xers in the middle who are kind of being forgotten, and all the millennials who are going to get the cash. Those are three generations that don't know how to talk about money with each other. To me, the metaverse is a place where that would be amazing.
I actually think that's fantastic. You've hit one of my passion spots as well. I actually hosted a LinkedIn Live panel discussion recently around financial digital literacy, and exactly on how can we and the banks ensure that individuals get the education that they require as both digital capabilities get more complex, but also financial decisions and financial livelihood becomes more and more complex. I mean, we've gone a little bit off tangent here, but your answer there around, use the metaverse almost to build your brand around delivering advisory capabilities and educate the community in financial literacy is a fantastic idea. I absolutely love that. Why hadn't I thought of that? I like it. It's very good. I actually want to jump back onto the brand a little bit, because as banks try to build their brand and moving towards this complete online digital that you're talking about, there is a fundamental growth of influencers. that, you know, these organizations that are trying to build their brand actually have very little control over. They possibly do try sometimes to have control over them, but how does a bank build a build a brand and maintain a brand when they are surrounded by influences of multiple types that they cannot theoretically control?
That's really interesting. And one of the principles that we talk about in the book is this idea of kind of embracing some tension, because that's a classic example of bank thinking versus brand thinking. Yeah. How can we control this? If you went into that situation saying, you know, how can we engage? How can we be part of that conversation? How can we increase our relevance to the people that we want to engage with? And getting the right influencers, and not trying to manage the influencers, but trying to be part of their story is brand thinking. So there's a little bit of trying to get out of that, I can't control anything anymore, and think maybe that's a good thing. It's going to feel really weird. People are going to feel really uncomfortable. Compliance people all around the globe will be having a heart attack. But that is the reality of the world, which the next generation, it's not even the next generation, you know, we're talking, you know, the millennials are in their 40s now. We're talking the main income earning, the main transacting group of people all engage in that way, and banks just need to kind of catch up with it. And it does mean obviously not taking risks you're not prepared to take. You've got to protect your brand, but you shouldn't protect your brand at the expense of doing something new and different and really relevant to customers.
So brand clearly is a vehicle for communication, I guess, between banks and their customers. I mean, and if you take care of that, you're able to maybe articulate better what are you standing for as an institution, and what is the value that we're bringing. But that brings me to a bit of a turn in the conversation, perhaps. But the amount of investments that banks are doing to be more digital, to be in the metaverse, to do all these fancy things that everybody keeps on talking about. I don't think actually it's a lack of investments or even willingness of banks to actually do this. So we see these fantastic headlines of JP Morgan and the other big guys investing billions and billions in digital transformation. Yet, at least the perception from a regular customer point of view is that where are those billions going? I might get a small little feature in my mobile banking app, but I mean, nothing's really changing. Do you think let me formulate the question this way. What do you think is behind this disconnect? Because clearly the billions are doing something, but it's not visible to the customer. So why is this disconnect happening?
Okay, so I've got some very strong feelings on this. So this is where all the past 10 years of my career just kind of all bubble up. Think about when people are making investment decisions about technology, who makes those decisions and who runs those projects? They're largely people that are extremely removed from the front line of customers and from what really happens in the bank. They are the CTOs, they are the chief strategy officer, they are people that do not really engage with customers. And typically when people go into a transformation exercise, it's about transforming the technology. It's not really about transforming the customer experience. Because I don't know about, I assume you kind of get involved in these large projects as well, but I spend my time talking about bytes and bits and efficiency and security and data protection. And if the customer gets a look in those conversations, it's when people start to think about launch. Whereas it should actually be totally flipped on its head. And if you're going to invest $1,000 or $1 billion, the customer conversation needs to happen at the beginning. Because it may well be, you know, do I really care that I've got this tiny little new feature in my app? Maybe not. Yeah. Is it nice? Yeah, sure, it's nice. Is it going to make my ability to manage my money better? Probably not. Is it going to make me feel better about my money? Probably not. Is it going to make me feel better about you as my bank? Really, probably not. And I think that's the answer. Customers don't get into that investment process early enough.
So that actually leads on to another related question. The book is called Think Like a Brand, Not a Bank. How do you think like a brand when you are a bank?
Oh, wow. Okay. Great conversation. Great question. So I think that, I mean, that's a really good example. So brands think about delivering value to customers. Okay, so one of the most controversial things that we say in the book, which every time I talk about it, the room kind of goes, is we say, do not be customer first. Yeah, and I guarantee you, if you look at all the mission statements of all the banks around the world, pretty much all of them say something about being customer first. Yeah. What brands do is they understand where a fair exchange of value happens. So what is it that you are going to deliver, and what is it you're going to stand for, and what are your customers going to get out of that? And the successful banks, and that's where you get the not investing $1 billion in a couple of features in an app. Yeah. If you really understand where the connectivity is between what you want to do as a brand and what you stand for and what your customers want and need, that's when a fair exchange of value happens. And that is what brands do really well and what banks don't do really well. So think about the fair exchange of value. Don't think customer first. Don't think bank first. Don't think technology first. Think about the concept of where that fair exchange of value happens. That's where relationships get built. And that's what brands do really well. Then it's unpacking how to get to that decision.
Yeah, I get that. There's so many thoughts about that. I guess banks sometimes may say that they're customer first, but really they're risk management first or compliance. So we could have a lot of fun discussions about those topics as well. Yeah. But I do have to completely agree on that that message that actually it's not about customer first. If you think about in Finland, everybody has their favorite story about Nokia mobile phones because it was such a big thing in Finland. And looking at the situation when iPhone launched, and then they're looking at the portfolio of devices that Nokia had built, I think a lot of those devices were built on customer feedback. They usually wanted another button on the phone, and Nokia was of course happy to comply because again that is customer-centric product design. So a lot of the phones ended up being quite weird and clunky due to the reason that they basically just gave more what the customers were asking for. And if you look at the age of Apple today and compare that to the same age Nokia, the portfolios look very different. Essentially, Apple is providing the same device with a few changes here and there in terms of size and price and things like this, but it's not like a complete spectrum of different devices because they are so certain of their branding. I guess that's the bottom line.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the thing that Apple do really well is that they have a community. Yeah, and they've worked really hard on building rituals around, being an Apple user. And you might not like them. They're actually not as fabulous, I think, as everyone, has become kind of conditioned to believe. But they are what they are. And that whole thing about consistency of experience, knowing what you're going to get, feeling like you're part of something is why Apple is really so successful. I'm their product and technology, but that is the difference between them as a brand. And in the book, we use not the Nokia, but we use the Samsung example, and it's exactly the same thing. If you look at the growth of Nokia versus Samsung, very product orientated on the Samsung side, but Apple very focused on the brand, the community, and everything that goes along with that. And their success, financials, and everything reflects that.
I really like that. I'm still I'm sitting here pretending for a minute to be I was going to say a gray-haired old, but I am gray-haired and I am old. But as a gray-haired old CEO of a large bank, and the first question I probably would have in my head is, but Apple is Apple, and we're a bank, and how on earth can we as a bank even start to think like Apple with their ecosystems and their everything else? So it adds to that question. How does the bank take that transition to to think like a brand like Apple?
Yeah. So I think that there's a really important shift that's required in terms of decision making in banks. So what, in my experience, working from the tiniest community bank up to working for some of the larger institutions, is that banks' decision making is organized around product set largely. And it's organized around very traditional roles and silos. So number one, hello, are you a retail customer or are you a business banking customer? Yeah, so if you've had time to read the book, we kind of open with a kind of gentle poke at the banking industry, which is a vision of what would happen if a bank manager took over Starbucks.
Yeah.
And for me, that really kind of, where you have to go to one counter if you want a business coffee, another counter if you want a personal coffee. If you want to get into sandwiches, you have to go and sit in a separate room and be advised and sold sandwiches. To me, that's if your institution is organized around products, is organized around skill sets, or even, what I consider to be kind of fake constructs of customers, then you're never going to be able to think like a brand, because you're going to think like a lending officer, and your decisions are going to be based on what impacts it's going to have on lending. You're going to think like the retail officer, you're going to think like the CTO.
Yeah.
Whereas none of that decision making is around the idea of a customer. And one of the examples, and I'm sorry, I realize I'm probably boring everyone, but I absolutely adore Patagonia as a brand. And if you just look at what they did around their, recent decisions about how they're going to run the company in the future, one of the things that I love about them is they have this guy called Vincent Stanley, who's their director of philosophy.
Wow.
So if you think about the decisions that you're going to make as a business, when the people sitting around the table are things like your chief innovation officer, your director of philosophy, your mission advisor, think about the different decisions that you would make in that scenario than when you've got your chief lending officer, your chief retail officer, your CEO, etc. No offense at all, these are all incredibly important roles, and they're the core of bank thinking, but it needs some refreshed thinking, and it has to start with the structure of decision making in the bank.
And I think I'm gonna reflect back onto something that Ville said a little bit a while ago and questioned. Again, sitting as the old, CEO part of the bank here. Yeah, that sounds great. And I love the sound of all of those titles, but we're a regulated industry, and I need to worry about what the regulators are going to say. And when they come and knock on my door and want to audit me, it doesn't help me to have a head of this or a head of that, because we need to follow the line.
Yeah. So again, just kind of my perspective on that is that absolutely. So I'm not saying, sack your compliance officer, sack your AML kind of team. I would say bring them in the innovation process. So I've had the pleasure, I talk about her a lot, our chief compliance officer at Nimbus, and she's really kind of advocating for this. I'm going to use the wrong phrase, but this is how I internalize it, is compassionate compliance. So it's this idea that if you go into a conversation, whether it's with the regulators or with your compliance officer, with the shared goal of getting to a yes, what that does is it gives you permission to get out of the comfort zone. And it's like step by step by step. So, I'm not an advocate of rip everything up, start with a new piece of paper, do whatever you want and see what works. Not like that at all. It's about taking the strengths, and we talk about this concept of remixing. What are the strengths you have within your bank, and what can you do with them differently? How can you take those little steps, step by step, outside of the comfort zone to get to something bigger. And that means changing the conversation with the regulators, with compliance that says, let's all get in this together, because that's how a brank will do it as well. A brand will do it as well.
Brank. Okay, that's an invented. Yeah. So the takeaway from this seems to be that well, even incumbent banks then still have some hope left. So you don't have to blow up everything. You can actually do something to be better in terms of branding. Is that right?
100%. One of my favorite quotes in the book is from a guy called Corey LeBlanc, who's recently set up a de novo very tech forward de novo in South Florida that Allison and I and Nimbus worked on. And his quote is, if you believe that you have to change everything to be innovative, good luck to you. And that whole message is, you don't have to, and I always get this phrase wrong, it's throw the baby out with the bathwater. Okay, you want to keep the baby because you love the baby, and the baby does some really amazing, great things, and then you build new and different and challenging things around that, because that's your comfort zone. Love your comfort zone, but step out of it. Embrace that, try new things, bring the right people in to make sure those decisions are right decisions for the institution. And, you know, forget this whole blank piece of paper thing. That's really hard.
Yeah. So speaking about building things, let's switch gears a little bit and start talking about a slightly techier part of this conversation. And that's, of course, that the one of the oldest memes in fintech, and been talking about this many episodes as well here on Fintech Daydreaming, and that is the usage of data. So banks have a lot of data about the customers. We've been talking a lot about how you can and cannot use that data and so forth. But let's bring that data discussion to the context of branding. So how can banks actually use data or use this data capability to build their brand in a new way?
So I think, you know, and this is a great example of how there is fear around what you can and can't do with your data and how you do and don't use it. I feel like banks have all of this richness of data, which can be analyzed without it having to be personalized. So there's so much insight that you can get from the data that you have without having to stray into, you know, concerns about PPI, etc. And the other thing that I'd say is data is not just transactional data. You've got tons of data about people that, you know, visit your website. You've got tons of data about people that come into your branches. You have 1 million conversations a day. That's all data. But what you don't have is a mechanism for that data coming into the way I serve, the decisions that I make. So to me, it's really about taking a long, hard look at what is my data infrastructure. And by that, I don't mean just the data from your core system. I mean, where is all the other pieces of data that you've got that can tell this customer story? And then getting the right people in to look at it. Because again, what I've experienced is a lot of analytics happens in banks, but it looks at the past. So where data is really interesting and what I'm really passionate about is what can it tell you about the future? How can you listen to conversations that tells you what's the next thing your customers are thinking about? How can you look at that data and predict what's going to happen? And if banks get that predictive data mindset on and build the analytics and the data storage infrastructure to facilitate that, that's when it's going to become really powerful. And that is what brands do today. We use the example of European, actually, of Tesco and what they did with their Clubs card. You know, really Tesco's Club card database is worth more than the retailer itself, because of the richness of that data. And that's a brand mindset. Looks like a loyalty card. It's not. It's an amazing data set.
Absolutely. There is a bit of a risky line here, when you look at the collection of data and how you use that data to build your brand, because you get to a point where there's a line between being advisory and supportive and being creepy, right? Because you suddenly get to the point where the customer goes, whoa, this is a bit too creepy, you're a bit too close, you're scaring me now, and then you ruin your brand as a bank, right? So how do you find that balance as you're using your data?
I mean, that comes back to the conversation that we just had about defining the concept of a fair exchange of value.
Yeah.
Okay. So we go back to the Tesco Club Card example, or, you know, it could be any retailer's loyalty scheme, is that I loved my Tesco Club Card because they seemed to know exactly what I was going to buy and they gave me money off it. That's not creepy. That's a fair exchange of value. And I am happy to give you my data if you're going to give me something of value in return for my data. The point at which it gets creepy and where it crosses that line is where what you're doing is you're putting your agenda, using data to further your bank agenda, as opposed to using data to make my life better. So that's, to me, that's the predictive piece. So if you look at, you know, the one thing I hate, I've noticed that you've been eating at, you know, Wild Wings for the past, you know, 4 or 5 days. Would you like to do that some more? And I'm like, God, no, have I really? Yeah, that's not a fair exchange of value because I'm feeling a bit guilty because I'm having my kitchen done and that's the closest place to, you know, where I live. But when I get something that says, I've really thought about what's important to you, and, you know, this is something that I think is going to really make a difference to you. I'm like, yeah.
I think it reminds me of, there was the famous story some time back, wasn't there, of a supermarket chain that managed to identify that a young girl was pregnant and sent her, you know, advertisement for baby products before she'd even managed to tell herself and her family, right? So it's
Yeah.
you know, there is certain boundaries maybe sometimes.
Yeah, I do have to mention that I believe that is an urban legend, but again, please verify the stories. But again, it's a great story and still tells a lot about how this data can be used, perhaps in the wrong way. So
absolutely, yeah,
important conversation. But I think that you bring up, Liz, an interesting point. It's not really about the fact that, well, I may even see that they see a lot of private data about me, but it's how they give the messaging around that. So I might recognize that this is based on my private data that I don't want to be shared. But the value exchange, as you mentioned, is the key point. So it's not really a binary conversation in terms of this is private and this is not. It's about the value exchange.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, you know, I'm into, you know, this, you know, the opt-in piece, you know, and I have the right to decide what part of my data and how you use my data. And I have the right to choose not to let you to do that as well as a bank. So your job as a bank or a brand is to make sure that I continue to be willing to share that information, which gives you a high standard with which you need to think about using and protecting and managing my data as well. And to me, that is a dialogue. And, you know, with all the kind of changes that are happening, particularly around kind of, you know, cookies and everything, the marketing world is going to change dramatically. And it's going to be really important for brands and banks to have that dialogue. To your point, it's not a one way, I'm going to take all the stuff and do what I want with it. It's going to become a two-way conversation about data. And I think that's a good thing. I know it's a pain in the butt. And, you know, it's going to be a hassle for, you know, all of us that are kind of at the coalface, but I think it's good.
Yeah. Something that just occurred to me is that you mentioned Tesco, the club card. And there's this wonderful book called Scoring Points, which I loved. And the reason why it's so interesting, if you read it today, you're thinking, well, this is kind of obvious stuff. But that was written before Facebook became a thing, before this targeted advertising and social media data targeting became like a common thing. So looking at the way they took control of those data sets and built this scheme that we've now heard is actually working for a lot of their customers is a fascinating story. So a bit of a shout out there for a book to read, of course. But speaking of Tesco, speaking of examples, you already mentioned a couple of good examples of how banks can enhance their branding and be better at messaging through branding. Is there any other example of somebody who's doing a really spectacular job in branding? And maybe on the other side as well, do you think somebody's doing a poor job? And if you don't want to mention names, of course, maybe we can just talk about the common mistakes that banks might be doing.
Sure. I think that and obviously I'm a little bit biased, but if one of the comparisons or experiments that we suggest people do in the book is to go and open up, and I am going to pick on Bank of America, I'm sorry, but if you open up the Bank of America website and then you go on, you open up Chime or Varo or one of the new kind of niche banks, like one I worked on is for Hitched, which is a bank for kind of newlyweds. And if you just do that, it becomes really obvious who are thinking like a brand and who are thinking like a bank. And, I use that example because if you open up, of course, it's personalized, so it changes every kind of day. But it's pretty much screaming Bank of America, screaming rates. There's a whole like 15 kind of products. It's, are you small business? Are you, an enterprise? Are you a retail customer? And all of that structuring of product selling and information doesn't allow you to connect with what's the outcome of banking. So one of the things, common mistakes, is product centered, rate-based versus outcome. Okay. And a good website is not one that shows smiley happy people from multiple generations and multiple ethnic groups next to your product and rates. Your lifestyle. The classic one I look at is if you go to open up a business account with Bank of America, and then you go look at Square. Visually entirely different. Messaging is about outcome. Resonance to the business owner and problem, completely different. Product driven, outcome driven. So to me, that's one of the kind of the big shifts. And you know what? That's not that difficult to change because that's a mindset thing. Do we sell products or do we deliver outcomes? Do we worry about rates or do we engage with what matters and a fair exchange of value with the customers? So that's kind of like number one. Fintechs do it better, I believe, than banks today because they can, because they don't have all that legacy. They know, we talk about this concept of stop when you get to a yes. And if you think about, what you're trying to do, if you're a Square, is you want people to sign up for that first thing. And you want people to feel like, I recognize myself. This feels like this is going to make my life better. If you look at a big bank's digital sell, do you want a credit card? Do you want an account? Do you want this? Do you want that? Here's all the, blah, 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 blah. So that to me is a very common mistake. There are certain, we talk a lot, and this is a very US example, but there's an amazing bank called Umpqua Bank, which are based out of the Pacific Northwest up here. And they have this amazing legacy of innovation. And they were one of the first banks here to really focus on having a community presence. So their branches don't look like branches. I used to get, when I first moved here, I was really confused because there was this big one I couldn't say Umpqua. And they had this big kind of glass building on the corner of my local kind of shopping center. And there'd always be like all these like people in there knitting, or there'd just be people sitting there having a cup of tea. And I was like, what is Umpqua? And it was a bank that, you know, within a kind of context of the old style space, understood how to build a community. But what they did out of that, and there's amazing women that we talk about in the book called Rilla Delorier, and what she did is she recognized all of the value that came from being able to go sit in this space, have a cup of tea, meet your bank people, and do your knitting circle, you know? And they took that and they started investing in like a technology incubator. And they created this amazing piece of, you know, digital technology, which took all of that principle of the community, but used things like texting, like video calling, to create a way of that community sense, but through technology. Yeah. The other thing they did is the CEO had a telephone in every branch that went direct to their office. So their promise was, if you wanted to talk to the CEO of Umpqua Bank, go into the branch, pick up the phone, and it went through to his office. Yeah.
Fantastic examples.
Yeah.
I think I'd like to reflect, actually, not really a question, just reflect for a minute. I can understand, you know, listening to what you're saying, having read the book, etc. I can see where the drive of embedded finance is really coming from. The fact that the banks can't manage to react to this in the way that they should, whereas platform companies and other more, can I say, people-focused organizations are managing to engage in this, and it's easier for them to pull in banking capabilities as embedded services than it is for the banks to deliver on this new, you know, branded vision. So it's, you know, it's back to what I always keep saying, that the future of banking will be dominated by platforms, and they're not necessarily banking platforms. And it's up to the banks to decide how are they going to engage in this future platform economy. Either they need to become a brand, like you're saying, or they just need to continue as they are and deliver embedded banking capabilities into the cool kids that manage to actually deliver on this branded, customer-centric or outcome-centric future.
Yeah, and I think one of the big messages that we have in the book is quit fighting fintechs. Yeah. So banks, there's this whole psyche about, oh my God, we're going to die. How are we going to survive? The fintech's going to take over. And our message is, look, your most valuable asset isn't your customers. Your most valuable asset is your charter.
Yeah.
So what can you do creatively to enable the banking of the future? You know, think about it. Yeah. And there's that whole, you know, comes back to the, you know, the think about getting to a yes. You know, how can you take that really, really valuable asset and make that super relevant? That's brand thinking. What have I got in my portfolio that I can sell or position or get value from in a different way?
You know, during this episode, we've done a great job at kind of repeating all the cliches that we have in Fintech Daydreaming quite well. And Paul, I'm going to close the circle now and say the thing we always say, which is that time flies when you're having fun. So we are running up to the end of the episodes as I watch the time here. But before we do that, I did want to ask Liz, was there something that we didn't get to talk about that you feel is important for the discussion that we had today?
I mean, I think for me, the big, you know, the big message that Allison and I really wanted to get across from this is that everyone is an innovator. And brand thinking, the beauty of brand thinking is that it can happen anywhere in the organization and it can make a big change. Now, obviously, it's great if it's happening at the C-suite, but kind of one of my kind of little visions is that we can get a load of people kind of clutching the book that are doing something in their team that's different, that they're taking some of the principles and just trying it out. And this idea of lots of little guerrilla cells of brand thinkers in all the banks that eventually is going to create this kind of change, you know. I mean, that's our kind of grand vision of saying, you know, you don't have to be the CEO to make this happen. You can be a bunch of tellers sitting in a branch that are going to change what you do tomorrow. Yeah. And that's really the big thing. Innovation can be easy and it can happen anywhere if you think like a brand.
I love that. That's a really positive message to end the episode on. Surely we'll leave a lot of things to think about for our listeners as well. We have a lot of listeners who are working for banks, so I think that's something to keep in mind when thinking about your next things to do in your job. But as we round up, of course, we would like give you the chance to let our listeners know as well, how can they get in touch with you? How can they find the book, and perhaps maybe have a chat with you on one of the platforms? So how will they reach you?
Yeah, certainly. So we have a very long but very literal web address, which is www.thinklikeabrandbook.com. So you can find us there, and we've done additional resources off the back of the book. So we've got PowerPoint decks if you want to become one of our little gorilla cells. We've got slides and things that you can take away and use. You can find us on Twitter, and our handle is brand B4, as in letter B and 4 bank. I have to get that the right way around. And then you can find myself, you can find me on LinkedIn. Liz, hi, there's not very many of us, so I'm quite easy to find there. And the same thing with Allison Netzer, so you can find the two of us there.
Perfect. Thank you. Thank you for that. We will also add those on the show notes, so it will be easy for our listeners to get in touch if they feel like they want to continue the conversation. Now, with that being said, thank you, Liz, for being a guest. It was a really great conversation. I think we learned a lot. Thank you to you, Paul, as well, of course, as always. But most importantly, thank you to you, our listeners, for hanging out with us for another episode of Fintech Daydream. Now, we only ask you for one favor. We don't have any sponsors. We don't have any ads. We only ask you to do one thing. Please subscribe, leave a comment and a positive review. That will help a lot for other people, other fintech nerds like us, in being able to find this podcast of ours. So please do that. Tell your friends, tell your family. And with that being said, we will see you in the next episode of our podcast. This has been Fintech Daydreaming.
This is Fintech Daydreaming.